The Telltale Heart, page 555, published in 1843. The story begins in medias res, in the midst of things. We seem to be overhearing a conversation. To whom is the murderer speaking? We don't know. The indefiniteness makes it easy for the reader to imagine that the killer is speaking directly to the reader, as we can see from the reading of the opening paragraph.
True, nervous. Very, very nervous I had been, and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed them. Above all, it was the sense of hearing. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in the underworld. How then am I mad? Observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story.
What are the key themes of the story? Think about that as we go through this lecture. That would be a good journal discussion for this week. What causes the horror in the story? Look at the passages about precision. It is the precision that scares us. The narrator is seemingly mad despite the objections to the contrary. Note how each act is carefully premeditated. This evidence would normally be used in a court of law to demonstrate that the murderer is not mad, but the problem with the story is the motive. Is the old man's vulture eye sufficient motive to kill him? Normally not. So is the narrator mad? Madness for the narrator is the inability to communicate, hence his need to communicate to prove that he is not mad. This raises the question whether the narrator can be trusted. When you read a story, you need to ask yourself whether the narrator is trustworthy or whether the author is telling a different story from the one that the narrator is telling. So is the narrator trustworthy? No. So what story is the author telling us through the narrator? That indeed the narrator is mad? The fact is that the narrator is clearly mad even though he insists on his sanity. His protestation becomes ironic because it produces the opposite effect on the reader. We are more convinced after reading the story that he must be mad. He bases his plea upon the assumption that madness is incompatible with systemic action, and as evidence of his capacity for the latter, he relates how he has executed a horrible crime with rational precision. What happens in this story? Nothing much. The story is obviously not driven by plot. The story must be considered from the point of view of psychology. In this story, we get a glimpse into the mind of a murderer, but also a man full of self-doubt and guilt. The story never explains why the narrator kills the old man. What the story focuses on is what happens to the narrator after he kills the old man. Self-confidence on the outside, conscience is riddled with guilt. Using Freud's terminology, we see the conflict of the id and the superego, which are constantly battling inside our minds. The id is instinct. The narrator instinctively despises the old man, and the id has control over the narrator's psyche. The id is in control when the narrator kills the old man. Ego and the realistic organizing part of the psyche. The superego, the critical and moralizing part of the psyche. Before the officers arrive, the id is in control. The id rules when the narrator murders the old man. On page 558, there's a brief emergence of the superego or conscience when the narrator fears that the neighbors will hear the old man's beating heart.
But the beating grew louder, louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor.
This also prefigures the ending of the story, but the id takes control as we can see in the detailed precision where the narrator, without emotion, describes the dismemberment of the old man's body. When the police officers arrive, the narrator is self-confident. The id is still in control. In fact, it is arrogant because the narrator actually invites the police officers into the very room where the body lies buried beneath the floor, as we see on page 559. But slowly, the narrator starts to feel uncomfortable. Quote, "But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone." And he starts to hear the heartbeat. I found that the noise was not within my ears. At first he doesn't know what it is and tries to talk over it, but it gets louder and louder.
I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder!
In his superego, his conscience asserting itself. As first, the id tries to talk it down, but the superego continues to grow until the narrator reveals the truth. The superego wins out.
"Villains," I shrieked, "dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart."
The dead man's heart isn't really beating, which is why the police officers don't hear what the narrator is hearing. But in his paranoia, he assumes that they do hear it and are mocking him. So what is the sound he hears? Is it just in his head? Does he mistake his own heartbeat for the dead man's? Or is Poe turning to the supernatural and suggesting that a dead man's heart can really continue to beat? This is a good journal topic. Opening paragraph heightens of the sentence, especially of hearing. This is a direct invocation of American transcendentalism, especially Emerson's treatise Nature. American transcendentalism was an important movement in philosophy and literature that flourished during the early to middle years of the 19th century, about 1836 to 1860. It began as a reform movement of the Unitarian Church, extending the views of William Ellery Channing on an indwelling God and the significance of intuitive thought. It was based on a, quote, monism holding to the unity of the world and God and the immanence of God in the world, according to the Oxford Companion to American Literature. For the Transcendentalists, the soul of each individual is identical with the soul of the world and contains what the world contains. One important aspect of Transcendentalism is self-reliance. What we see at the beginning of the story is an immense sense of self-reliance. The narrator attempts to make the case that all of his actions are reasonable, rational, and necessary. Given the horrors of murder for no seemingly obvious cause, the reader's reaction to that self-reliance is one of horror. We are horrified by this self-reliant, hypersensitive creature, what we would call evil, who claims that he can hear the beating heart of a dead man. What is the gender of the narrator? The story is told in first person, yet not once is the gender identified in the story. Undoubtedly, all of us identify the narrator as male, assuming that the narrator is a relative or a close friend of the old man's, living together, taking care of the old man. The psychoanalysts read the narrator as the old man's son. Maria Bonaparte, student of Sigmund Freud, wrote an entire study dedicated to psychoanalyzing Poe through his literary works. She reviews the relationship between father and son, the old man and the narrator. The quote son kills his father following Freud's classic Oedipus complex. The son kills the father because he is jealous of the father's relationship to the mother. Or, as Bonaparte suggests, Poe is projecting his own hatred of his foster father in the story. Yet the caretaker could just as likely be a woman. There is nothing in the narrative that says that the murderer could not be a woman. Listen to Nicole Doolan's reading of the story, interpreting the narrator to be a woman. This full story is in the supplemental materials. Here's an excerpt, the ending of the story.
No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently, and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound. Much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles, in high key and with violent gesticulations. But the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God! What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart.
So imagine that the narrator is a woman. How does that change your reading of the story? What perceptions differ knowing that the murderer is a woman, perhaps the old man's nurse? Look at the beginning. Quote, "You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me." Note that when the narrator is assumed to be male, we focus on the dichotomy of mad versus not mad. However, if we assume that the narrator is female, we focus on male versus female. In other words, mad men know nothing, but mad woman, that's a different story. Or paragraph 2, "I loved the old man." When we read that, assuming the narrator is male, we assume some kind of friendship or love of a family member. If the narrator is female, however, what becomes of the notion of love? It becomes romantic. Perhaps the murderer is even the old man's wife or companion. What about the issue with the eye? Could the eye represent a panic that a woman feels when she is being watched or observed by men, a common theme in feminist writing? Could it be that a motive that was missing from the story when we assume that the narrator is male? What about when the police are there? Isn't it strange that at 4 a.m. the narrator feels it necessary to engage the police in a lengthy conversation? What would you do if the police knocked on your door at 4 a.m. saying that they got a call from a neighbor who heard a scream? Wouldn't the police be satisfied initially after taking a quick look around and no evidence of a disturbance, no signs of robbery or foul play? So why would the narrator invite the police to have a seat at 4 a.m. like a tea party? When the narrator is assumed male, We are tempted to think that despite what the narrator says at the bottom of page 558 about the shriek and the old man being in the country, the officers still suspect something, hence they're lingering. But what if the narrator is female? Do we have a different perception of why the officers would stay longer? Are the officers just being polite to accept the narrator's offer to have a seat? Is the female narrator feeling compelled to enter into conversation because she fears the patriarchal authority that the police represent? Some ideas for writing a paper that work with the ideas that we presented thus far. First, assume that the narrator is male. Why might the narrator have decided to kill the old man? You might want to analyze the story according to the homosocial, homoerotic continuum and ideas about homophobia. Second, assume that the narrator is female. Analyze the story as a woman's triumph over an oppressive male, paying particular attention to the significance of the evil eye. Third, make no assumptions about gender of the narrator. Analyze the story as a metaphor for the struggle between the id, the ego, and the superego. Or 4, assume the narrator is male. Analyze the old man as the narrator's doppelganger and pay particular attention to the symbolism of the eye and the heart. That last interpretation raises an interesting interpretation of the story. That is, that perhaps there was no murder. There was only an old man who imagines murdering the old man. In other words, everything is in his head, which would make him mad. His mind steps out of his body, so he sees himself as a separate being that he despises. In other words, he imagines murdering himself. If you pay attention to the text, this interpretation also explains a lot in the story. How the old man never saw the sliver of light coming out of the lantern. How can such a small sliver as a single ray realistically come out of a lantern anyway? How there is no blood or evidence so shortly after the murder. The blood is captured by a tub by hacking a body to pieces, which surely produce splatter on furniture and on the clothing. And how did the narrator dispose of the blood? How was the body disposed of so quickly? The fact that at the end of the story, the narrator still hears the heart of the old man. Is it his own? The fact that the police stay after they examine the premises. Are they suspicious that the narrator is mad because he keeps referring to himself in the third person? Look for other clues in the story. I'd like to finish the lecture with a reading from Thompson's work, Poe's Fiction. Quote, The Telltale Heart, 1843, a study in obsessive paranoia, is yet another story of the mind watching itself disintegrate under the stress of delusion in an alienated world. It is the perverse fortune of the narrator to become fearful of the grotesque eye of a kindly old man whom he says he loves. With a double perversity, he gives himself away to the police at the moment of success. Yet the narrator is caught in a weird world in which he loves the old man, yet displays no real emotion toward him, in which he cannot let the beloved old man live, and yet cannot kill him without remorse, in which he cannot expose his crime, and yet must do so. The most blatant absurdist irony is that the apparent beating of his own heart, which he mistakes first as the beating of the still living heart of the old man, and which second seems to be an emblem of his own guilt, and which finally compels him to confess, may very well be initially the particular thumping of the wood beetles gnawing at the walls. What tale does the heart tell? The beating of the heart is linked to the theme of time. Every beat marks an irretrievable moment in time that takes one closer to death. What does the eye have to do with the narrator's killing the old man? The answer lies in determining relationships between time and heart, identity I, and inner reality versus outer reality over acuteness of hearing. One would think that if the narrator's hearing were so acute, it would not be the old man's eye, that is the organ of sight, that would be so important to him. However, by saying that hearing is important, the narrator instructs the reader, don't look, but listen. When we listen to the word I, rather than look at it, we understand that when the narrator says he must destroy the I, E-Y-E, he means he must destroy the I, the pronoun I, a hypothesis that ties together all of the story's motifs except the time heart theme. Once we know that by killing the old man, the narrator fulfills his desire to destroy himself, all that is left to understand is the motivation for this act of self-destruction. Since every heartbeat brings us closer to death, once one becomes obsessed with the inevitability, one desires to avoid it. The narrator's logic is that since the I, or ego, makes one the inevitable heir to death, the only way to save the self is to destroy the self. But that is an intolerable paradox, so the narrator projects the self onto the other and does not wish to destroy the I directly, but only indirectly by destroying the I, E-Y-E, of the old man with whom he identifies.